this computer. So does anybody know what a virtual environment is and what it's the purpose of a virtual environment?
It's kind of like where in Node you have local and global. The virtual environment is like the local version of a global environment. So you'll create basically a copy of a Python interpreter and all of your packages, your base packages, and you add your packages to your virtual environment so that you're not adding them globally. And that keeps your whole package contained, and you can have that on GitHub, and you can have your requirements listed. And that way, when somebody wants to use your package, they already have all the requirements that they need and all the packages with it.
Yep. So yes, exactly. So a virtual environment is essentially creates a bubble, like a local bubble on your computer that you can install all kinds of packages and software in, and it won't conflict with anything else on your computer, because a lot of times you might have software or be working in applications that use the same packages but different versions of those packages. So what you want to do is create a virtual environment and install one package with a specific version, and then when you're working in another application, create another virtual environment on your machine where you have the same package but with a different version. So those versions don't conflict. So it's kind of like you're making a wrapper or a bubble or a small partition on your local machine in which you're able to install packages that won't conflict with anything out in like on your global desktop or on your like actual machine. So with that, the first thing I need to do is actually create a virtual environment. Does anybody know how I do create a virtual environment in Python? All right. It's okay if you don't. So in order to create a virtual environment in Python, I just run, so I'm in my Python SQL directory. I'm going to run ls python -m make virtual venv, so make a virtual environment, followed by what do I actually want to call that virtual environment. I can literally name it anything. We usually just call it venv, like create a virtual environment and name it venv. So it does not doing anything. It's creating a virtual environment. Great, nothing happened. But if I list everything there, I have a virtual environment in this specific directory in Python, my Python SQL directory. So anything I install in this virtual environment when I'm actively in it won't conflict with anything outside of it. So I've created a virtual environment, but now I actually have to go into the bubble. I have to actually go into the virtual environment. Does anybody know how I activate my virtual environment? So
I think it's source, venv, and then bin.
Activate. Yep. So it's source venv, which is the name of my virtual environment, bin activate. And now keep an eye of this, the current working directory, and see what happens. So now it says venv. So right now I'm currently in my virtual environment. So now I can actually install anything on here. So it's kind of like a clean slate. Nothing's really substantially installed. Now I can go ahead and install my Psycopg2 module. So I can do list. So I don't really have anything in here. I'm still in my virtual environment. I'm going to pip install. Is it Psycopg2? And it's called Psycopg2. Collecting. Does anybody have any questions on the virtual environment? So it says successfully installed Psycopg2 2.8.5.
So at this point, we're just installing the different packages and or like modules if we're running a JavaScript virtual environment. But we don't actually have to reinstall Python or
right.
Node. Okay.
Yeah. And this is strictly for Python right now. You don't need, there are really virtual environments in JavaScript. That's just what the package.json file enables you to do. So virtual environments, yes.
I'm just curious, what's the normal use case? Like, how often should we be using new virtual environments?
When you're using Django, every time you create a new Django project or anytime you're in a new Django project.
So each project should live in its own virtual environment?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
And
Tom?
that Psycop, in the second P, are there two Ps or is it PG2 or PPG2?
So basically,
It
So
just
I'm
came up as PP on mine, that's it.
so here's, it's just, where to go? Changes between Psycopg2. It's just the one PG2.
Gotcha.
Hey, Tom, can I just say a side note real quick
Yep.
before everyone starts? Anyone who does it this way, where they do the Python module VE and V, it creates the virtual environment folder inside of your project folder. If you're doing that, you don't have to upload that VE, that virtual environment folder to GitHub. GitHub doesn't need a copy of the Python interpreter. You can ignore it from GitHub. So I see a lot of people do that where they upload their virtual environment thinking that people can use it. No one can use your virtual environment. You can ignore it from uploading to GitHub.
Yep.
It's only for your machine only, but you do want to include a requirements.txt file, which we probably will get to.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a few weeks when we're actually going out with Django. So yeah, so when you are uploading your like a project or anything that utilizes a virtual environment, just include a git ignore file and include that V and V. So I'm in my virtual environment, and what I want to do is create a database, a Postgres database called class roster, and that only stores, your name and your favorite food. So I'm going to create just a Python file called class roster.py. I'm going to list it. There's my class roster. I'm still inside my virtual environment. I'm going to code class roster. And now I'm in my class roster, but I need to create a database. So I'm going to create a database on my local machine called class roster. And it's create db class roster. Oh, that one already exists. I did this yesterday. So I'm going to drop db class roster. It's dropping it. Come on. Removal failed. Database class. Oh, what? I've got something open. Yep, that's what it is. Let's try this again. Cool. Clear. Let's try to create that one more time. Cool. I created a class roster. I'm going to PSQL into my class roster to ensure that there's nothing in there. Cool. So I did not find any relations. Great. So I'm looking at the Psycopg2 documentation. As I said before, software development's like 80% reading documentation, 20% actual coding. My last job, what did I have to do? I had to create so we were rewriting our entire community part of our app, and I had to create a select dropdown that was like a filter. That's what I had to create. So you like current news or like current, essentially it was a filter. Anyways, my designer came to me and she's like, here's the design of the filter. So I had to go and see how to manipulate the default select dropdown to match her design. And it took me about 4 to 6 hours one day of just reading documentation of how I can manually create or manipulate the select dropdown to meet her design. And after like 4 to 6 hours, I got kind of close to it. It still looked good, but it didn't match her design like precisely. And after like the 6 hours, I was like, listen, like, I don't think it's feasible, like technically speaking, with the current resources to match your design. Does what I create, like, is that okay for you? And she's like, yeah, that works. Like, we can get by with that. And it still looked good. It just didn't match her design. But, you know, as engineers, like, I just wasn't satisfied with me not being able to match her design. So the next day I spent another like 3 to 4 hours just reading documentation, just reading documentation and trial and error, trying to get this thing to match her design. And it took me about 10 hours just to get her a select drop down to match her design. And it was literally just reading through documentation and trial and error. So as something as easy as like a little select drop down. But, you know, just want to emphasize reading documentation. So with that, little tangent, Psycopg2, this is the basic usage of it. So I'm going to just go through what I first have to do. I have to import Psycopg2. So it kind of, IntelliSense already kind of knows what it's want, a Python driver from Postgres SQL. Psycop is a Postgres database adapter for Python programming language. Great. And the first thing I need to do is connect to the database, my class roster, via Python. So the first thing I need to do is create a connection to that. So I can do connection equals Psycopg2 dot connect. This is a built-in method in Psycopg2 with a string. Let's do an F string followed by the DB name equals class roster and the user of this current machine. So my current user on my MacBook is was it TA Preet, but you don't want that hard coded. So you want to actually have a built-in method to actually get the current user of your local machine, which is os.getLogin. And with that, so that's actual code. I'm going to do an F string, and I also have to import OS. So I need to create this, will create a connection to my class roster database. This connect in the documentation. If you look over here, connection, Psycopg2, connect, database name, test, user, and it's the user of your current local machine. Then it says, open a cursor to perform database operations. I'm going to just copy this over. So copy that. So I'm going to create a cursor equals connection dot cursor. All right. I'm looking over back here at the database or at the documentation. Now I am able to execute commands using a string of SQL, like a SQL query that's a string. So I'm going to create, so I've got my database class roster. There's nothing in here. Now I'm actually going to create a table. So I'm going to call it class roster table creation. And then, again, this is just Python right now. So I'm creating a variable called class roster table creation. And this is literally just going to be a string representation of a SQL query. So I can go create table students students ID. Why is it like that?
Hey, Tom, I think you meant to spell cursor with an R at the end, not an N.
Thank you. Cursor. So ID is serial, primary key, and then I'm going to do name, which is just a varchar. Let's do 200, and then favorite food with a varchar of 255. And then at the end of the query, why is there two? Yep. I need a semicolon. Now, I can actually execute this query by looking at the documentation. Ooh. What is that? Where'd the documentation go? Here we go. So executing a command, this creates a new table, cursor.execute creates this thing. So I'm going to just look at here. So the equivalent is cursor.execute. I'm going to pass in this table creation variable, which is this query, this SQL query. Now, let's actually, at the very end, so execute, so it says makes the connections. So I need to, once I execute it, this is just querying the database. I don't want to do that right now. I just want to create this table. I don't want to insert any data into it yet. So I need to make the changes to the database persistent. So I need to connect, commit, and then I can close the communication with the database. So I can, after I execute that, I can connection that commit that to the database to make it persistent. Then I can close the cursor, that close. And then I can also close the connection.
Your execute statement has the N at the end again.
Thank you. Is there anywhere else? So the first thing I did in this Python file, well, let's run this first. Clear, ls, I'm still in my virtual environment. I'm gonna run this class roster. Uh-oh, root does not exist. Interesting. So it says, line 27, this fatal error. So it looks like this get login, I'm gonna print this out. os.get login. I just want to see, because it should be TA preet. Okay, it says root. So something's going on there. So if yours does this, yours should work, but for whatever reason, mine doesn't work right now. I'm going to import another way I can get it, called another module called get pass. And instead of using the OS, I'm going to do get pass.get user, and that should work. That's another way I can get the current user of my machine. So I clear it. Uh-oh, unexpected ending. Let's try that again. Okay, nothing happened. That's usually a good sign. All right, let's investigate the class roster database to see if in fact this table was created by running this execute command. So I can \d. There we go. So here's my students. We can actually investigate the students table. Here we go. We have an integer as the ID, which is the primary key. We have the name, which is a varchar of 200. And the favorite food is a varchar of 255 right here. So let's just review quickly what we did. We imported the Psycopg2 module that allows us to make a connection to our Postgres database. The first thing I passed in I had to actually create a connection to the database by running this connect method and passing in the DB name equals the name of the database, as well as the user, which is get pass get user, which is the name of your root user for your laptop, your local machine. I could have easily hard coded that by just writing that, but I want this to work on any machine. I'm running either this, it's either os.get login. That might work for you. If that doesn't work for you, you can also import get pass and do get pass.get user. But get login should work for you. For whatever reason, it's not working for mine right now.
Yeah,
So-
it doesn't for me.
The os.get login?
Nope.
Okay, that's fine. Get user should work.
My guess is it's returning root. Perhaps Python is running as root.
Yeah, it's like you installed maybe something as root, like maybe your virtual environment, or yeah, maybe you installed Python as root or something weird.
Yeah,
Like you said, yeah.
It's
On the documentation, it says since it's checking the environmental variables, login name or username to find out who the user is. So when you created the virtual environment, we're running it in root.
okay. Yeah, at some point something changed. It used to work. I just haven't gone in enough to debug it or to change that. But for all intents and purposes, you can hard code this, but there's a couple of ways you can get the login by doing os.get login or get pass.get user. You might have to install this get pass module, but anyway. So I made a connection. I'm creating a connection variable. Actually, that's assigning it to this connection. I'm actually creating a connection to the database. I'm creating a cursor by doing connection.cursor, which allows me to perform database operations. And now I just created a variable, which is a SQL query that is a string. I'm executing cursor.execute, and I'm inputting this create table students. So it's executing this SQL query on my Postgres database. So this is exactly just like running your SQL file. And then I'm committing it to make the database persistent. It's almost like saving it. Then I'm closing the cursor, and then I'm closing the connection. These are always at the very end. Like always at the end of so yeah.
That connection commit there, like you said, there's that's just a common use of phrase that has nothing to do with GitHub. That's just
Correct. Yep. It's just a method on the connection when you're actually creating a connection to this. It's the same thing as doing like connect. It's just a built-in method in the Psycopg. So I created a table. Now let's actually write some information to it. So we can do, let's go with class or cursor.execute. And I'm just going to inject the SQL in here. So insert into students. What's the SQL way to do this? How do you insert data? So insert into students.
The column names.
So the column name followed by the favorite food, and values. Now this is where it gets a little different. So this execute, you can actually like execute. There's a lot of them. I can say insert into, oh yeah, I can just, the basic module usage, I can look at this. Pass. Oh. Pass data to fill a query, placeholders, and let Psycopg perform the correct conversion. So no more SQL injections. Cool. So it says insert into, the name of the table, values, but then we have this %s, %s, comma, %s, followed by a comma, and then that like a tuple almost of the values. So, Carol, what's your favorite food?
Seafood.
What is it? Seafood?
Mm-hmm.
Seafood. All right. Let's execute this a couple more times. Let's do. Ose, what's your favorite food? Julian, what's your favorite food?
Pad Thai.
How do you
All right,
pat?
so Tom was on mute.
Oh yeah.
PHAD.
PA, what is it?
PHAD.
Oh, okay. Yep, don't know that.
Go for beefsteak.
Beefsteak?
Yep.
All right. That's good for now. All right. So when we inserting data, we insert into students' name, favorite food, values, and where we would normally put the actual values, we put %strings as or %s as placeholder, comma, followed by the actual what we actually want to put in there. So this execute method takes in two parameters, the SQL query, as well as the values in a tuple. So if I execute this again, click exit, clear, should run, should create the table, should execute these 3 commands or 3 SQL queries by inserting the Carol, Julian's, and Osa's favorite food. It should commit that to save it to the actual database, close the cursor, and then close the connection.
Is there going to be any issues from line 13 not appearing to have a closed parentheses?
Line 13. Oh, yep. What did I must have messed that up.
That was roster table creation.
Thank you. So I'm going to run this again, and hopefully everything works. Uh-oh. Cursor.execute class. It says errors, duplicate table creation, relation students already exists. So I already created this table. In SQL, when we're writing, what do we usually put at the very top? Of when what is it?
The drop statement.
So drop table. Oh. And what is that? Drop. What's the
If
actual
exists.
drop table if exists?
I always just remembered it starting off as if exists. So if the if exists table name, and then it would be drop the table name, because you don't want to drop the table name if it doesn't exist.
Drop. So if exists, like students, is that how it went?
I
Yeah,
have
that's what
a
it
draw
looks like.
table if
Yeah,
it exists, and
Oh,
then
yeah.
a table name.
Oh, yeah. Like that? Right? Drop table if exists, students cascade. Is this correct? Yep. All right, so before, every time I create a table, I can do cursor, execute, drop table. So let's run this again. So it's going to come in here, create a connection to our database, opens a cursor. I'm creating two variables called drop table and class roster table creation. We're having a SQL query that's a string that drops the table if it exists, and then we have create the table. We're actually executing those SQL queries on our Postgres database. So we're dropping the table, we're creating the table, and then we're going to execute these. After we execute them, we're going to commit them, which is like saving it.
Do
Save.
a semicolon in the drop table.
Oh, thank you. Commit saves data to database. That looks better. Commits it, saves it, and then we're closing the cursor and then closing the connection. If I run this again, nothing happened. That's good. I can inspect the database by select star from students, and there we go. So, does anybody have any questions about this? Like just creating a connection, opening a cursor, executing SQL commands, inserting data, saving the data, closing the cursor, and closing the connection.
I'm assuming we set something as like a helper function where, let's say, we create a database or, or create a table as a function that we can use as a helper, and then we'd pass in the name of the table and then maybe the schema layout or something, and then we could assign it to the cursor. Okay.
Yep. So that's what the one benefit of utilizing Python and Psycopg2, and we'll get to this in the next, in the next part of the lecture, is you're able to scale this up, because writing all this stuff and writing insert into 3 times. What if the database was like 1,000, had like 1,000 rows, and I had to write this 1,000 times? That's not very scalable. So with that, I'm going to